What's up, guys? Welcome to the lecture on Chapter 24, Section 4, America Moves Towards War. The objective for this lecture is to learn about the American response to aggression in Europe and Asia, and the essential question is, what caused the United States to enter World War II? So we left off last lecture talking about the rise of dictators in Europe, Italy invading Ethiopia, Germany invading the Rhineland, Stalin taking over the USSR and purging his country of any resistance, and Japan invading Manchuria, then invading China, and expanding throughout the Pacific. America has put itself in a difficult situation, passing neutrality acts in 3 consecutive years in 1935, 36, and 37, refusing to get involved in this conflict. But over time, what Americans begin to realize is that if we don't get involved in this conflict, we better keep the bad guys from winning. Because if we don't, eventually we could become the victim. Because of that fear, and because of our natural alliance and partiality to countries like the United Kingdom and France, eventually in 1939, the Neutrality Acts have been amended a bit to allow cash and carry. And this sign really says it perfectly. Help the Allies now to win, so our men will never be necessary. In September 1st of 1939, Hitler began World War II by invading Belgium. By invading Belgium, he basically was bringing France into the war and eventually brought the United Kingdom into the war. Hitler and Stalin then started divvying up Poland, and he invaded Poland, and eventually Hitler will also invade the USSR, believe it or not, bringing Stalin onto our side in World War II. The cash and carry provision of the Neutrality Acts of 1939 technically wasn't breaking neutrality. It said, we will sell weapons to a country that is willing to pay cash and take those weapons back on their ship back to their country. Therefore, we're not going anywhere, and we're not using our ships to physically ship the material. So technically, it's just a business transaction. But everyone knew exactly what it was. You can't supply one belligerent with weapons and expect the other belligerent not to think that you're on the wrong side of the war. So many isolationists in the United States saw right through this and saw it for what it was, a violation of neutrality. In 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy announced the alliance of the Axis powers. Seeing that the United States was getting closer and closer to war, Japan, Germany, and Italy want to make sure they keep the U.S. out of war. What's the best way to do that? Announce an alliance between the three of them. This alliance of the Axis powers says if one is attacked, the other two will jump in and support them. What this means is if the United States goes to war with any of the three countries, Germany, Italy, or Japan, they will then be fighting a two-front war on both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, which will be an extremely difficult war to win. Recognizing this, the U.S. digs their heels in and once again tries to avoid any role in the war. On September 2nd of 1940, the U.S. gives 50 destroyers for naval bases in a swap with the U.K. What's happening is the U.K. is running out of money, and the United States of America is trying to figure out a way to continue to supply the United Kingdom to prevent us from having to fight in the war. But just in case we do get involved in war, the United States is not going to be unprepared like it was in World War I. We will be ready to go. And in that same month, 4 days later, September 6th of 1940, the United States passes a conscription law in which it can basically hold a wartime draft, even though technically we're at peace. 2 months later, FDR wins the election in 1940 over Wendell Willkie, securing his third term as President of the United States. FDR has now become the only president up to that point and ever to run and win 3 different elections for President of the United States, breaking the tradition of George Washington. Eventually, he'll actually win 4 elections as President of the United States. And following FDR's presidency, Congress will pass an amendment keeping presidents from running and winning more than 2 presidential elections. So, we have the cash and carry in place, but as I mentioned, the U.S. wants to do everything they can to keep our men from fighting in the war. So as France falls to the Nazis and the UK is really struggling in fighting Hitler, the United States decides they'll help out the UK even more. As they're running out of money, the U.S. decides that we're going to now pass not a cash and carry, but a Lend-Lease Act, in which we will actually lend or lease the material to the countries that need it, such as the USSR and the United Kingdom primarily, but also Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean area, and other countries like China, Australia, and New Zealand in the Pacific to fight the aggression of Japan. In June of 1941, Germany attacks its friend, the USSR, and the Soviet Union is now at war with Germany. This will become extremely important because after the United States enters the war against both Japan and Germany and Italy, it will be critically important that Germany is fighting the USSR because they suffer hundreds of thousands of casualties in the USSR, making it much easier for the United States and other Allied powers on the Western Front. Once Germany attacks the USSR, we also extend the Lend-Lease to the USSR. By the middle of 1941, the U.S. freezes Japanese assets, refusing to basically trade anything with Japan until they stop their expansion in the Pacific. And as you can see, as we know, we're getting closer and closer to war with each of these steps. In July of 1941, the U.S. Navy accompanies an envoy to the U.K., and what eventually happens is the next month, FDR and Churchill will meet right off the coast in the Atlantic to write the Atlantic Charter. Now, Churchill was hoping in July or August of 1941 he would be able to convince FDR to join the war. But FDR wasn't there yet because the U.S. doesn't have a good reason to join the war. As you guys know, the United States oftentimes does not get involved unless it has a good reason to. U.S. blood on U.S. soil or U.S. citizens killed by belligerent, aggressive attacks. None of that technically has happened yet. Yes, Japan, Italy, and Germany are all expanding. They created the Axis powers to keep us out of the war, but no one's actually attacked us yet. No one's fighting us yet. And to FDR, that's extremely important. He does not want to be the one to make the first attack. He thinks the dignity of the United States is too great for a move like that. But eventually war does happen. And first blood is extremely important. In the fall of 1941, just a couple months after the Atlantic Charter is written, German U-boats sink 2 U.S. destroyers and several merchant ships. The U.S. will then begin to arm its merchant ships. And before we go any further, I do want to say just one more thing about the Atlantic Charter, because I realized I didn't really explain exactly what the Atlantic Charter was. So Churchill wants FDR and the U.S. to get involved in the war, but they can't yet. So what Churchill and FDR do is they write up what is known as the Atlantic Charter, or war aims. So FDR and Churchill write down, this is what we want to accomplish through this conflict. These are our end goals. Recognizing the failure of the United States to clearly articulate their goals during World War I that led to a lot of frustration following World War I, FDR and Churchill want to make it very clear what they intend to accomplish. And so they laid out all their different war goals for World War II, just in case the United States ended up getting directly involved in the war, which we did. And the Atlantic Charter will serve as a template for how the U.S. plans on dealing with the post-war world. So the U.S. is arming its merchant ships against several German U-boat attacks, but FDR knows that some U-boat attacks here and there are not going to drag America into war again. A lot of Americans regretted being involved in World War I. It wasn't the best outcome. So FDR knows that it's going to need to be a lot more than that to drag the U.S. into war. In the fall of 1941, the U.S. finally cuts off all oil to Japan after Japan invades French Indochina. And if you look at this map, you can see just how much Japan has been advancing. The yellow is how much Japan advanced by 1937. Then you have this beige by 1938, and the orange by 1939. In 1940 and into 1942, all this purple has been invaded. And you can see the French Indochina, British Malaysia are not being defended because the French and the British are busy fighting Hitler in Europe. The United States knows that. And the United States knows if someone doesn't step up and stop Japan from expanding, they'll take over the entire Pacific. And they even might take over New Zealand and Australia, which is where they were heading next. So the U.S. cuts off their oil. But the Japanese know if they can't negotiate a deal to get their oil back with the U.S., this will all fall apart. This entire empire is based on the idea that the Japanese can continue to get oil from the United States. So Hideki Tojo, the general who basically takes over the Japanese government, in November of 1941, prepares Japan for war with the U.S. The U.S. had actually decoded Japanese messages and knew the Japanese were going to attack the United States. We just didn't know where or when it will happen. And FDR is determined that even though we know an attack is coming, he's not going to be the one to attack Japan. He knows if the United States is going to enter this war with the moral authority, they have to be attacked first, and they have to be responding to an attack. And that attack happened, as you guys I'm sure know. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Italy and Germany then declare war on the United States, and which is basically a blessing to FDR because he doesn't have to come up with a reason to declare a war on Germany. They declare it on us. And now, by December 10th, 1941, just 3 days after the attack, we're officially at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy, and the U.S. finds itself fully engaged in World War II. If you guys have any questions, please, as always, feel free to ask your history teacher.